like to welcome Doug Ray, our classmate, known to many of us, who's joining us today. And one of our main topics of discussion will be his adventures in the wilds, particularly on the Appalachian Trail, also the Long Trail in Vermont, which he's done the entirety of, and kind of peek back and see how that worked into his lifestyle, and also learn a little bit about his experience with Williams, as we have done with other people that we've talked to. And begin, of course, by welcoming Doug. And thanks, Doug, for agreeing to join us.
My pleasure.
Okay. So, how and why did you ever wind up at Williams?
Um, well, I, I wanted to go to a small school. I grew up in New Jersey, and I wasn't thinking about going, you know, to California or someplace really distant. There seemed to be quite a lot of good schools and colleges in the New England area, and I grew up as a Boy Scout and an Explorer Scout, and I really liked the outdoors, and ended up I saw Williams and fell in love with it just from because of the mountains and the access to just the kind of milieu that it is.
The natural beauty.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that draws a lot of people. What other schools did you consider before you chose Williams?
I had a an uncle that wanted me to go to Brown, so I did visit Brown,
Uh-huh.
but it was Providence didn't hold much appeal.
Uh-huh.
And I had another friend that tried to drag me out to Cornell, and I did go out there, but I don't know, I got turned off by it was a party weekend, and I don't know, it was all this fraternity stuff that
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have much interest in. And then Williams had just, made the decision to do away with fraternities, which I
Mm-hmm.
thought was a step in the right direction.
Uh-huh.
And and frankly, I had an interview with Phil Smith, and he basically sold me on Williams, and I never looked back. I applied early decision, got in, and that's all she wrote.
Uh, so, yeah, early decision means you didn't apply to any other school, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I did, I went to Amherst and had an interview there, but the sense I got from it from what Amherst was that we don't really need you. We'll do you a favor maybe if we decide to accept you type of thing.
Phil Smith's
Whereas Phil
enthusiasm.
Smith
Yeah.
was, I don't know, he was a great salesman for Williams and just a great guy to,
Yeah.
have interviewing prospective freshmen.
Yeah. And I remember he helped out with freshman soccer and
Yep,
was
yeah,
very
he
much
did.
present. And he showed up at our 50th reunion and
Yeah.
was great to see him. So, what about your experience at Williams? You did a lot. I know you were a star on the soccer team, or I consider you to be one.
No,
Um,
I was hardly a star. I managed to I played football in high school. I'd never played soccer. I remember I made the decision I would try out for the freshman team about, I don't know, 2 weeks before we were due to report. And I
mhm.
went out and practiced with the local high school team and learned how to kick with both feet just enough to, to be able to run around on the field. And the joke was later on that um, I played soccer the way I used to play football, running into people a lot. And at one of the after season get-togethers, dinners, and so on, they gave me the Hammer Award because I'd knocked out more of my own teammates playing in practice. So I was mostly I could run strongly and was reasonably fast and
Yeah.
could do some damage out there. But the guys with the real skill were the ones who had played 4 years or even more. Guys like Bill Blanchard and O'Grady and my senior year we had this guy named Marco Fierro from Colombia who really knew how to play the game.
Uh-huh.
It was fun and great exercise. And, of course, Jay Healy and Clark McFadden were two great fullbacks, and I went against them in practice every day.
Uh-huh.
So Clark was always complaining that I bumped into him way too much.
um, it is rumored that you scored a key goal in the game against Harvard, which I don't think Williams was really intended to win. Yeah.
I didn't score very many goals the whole time. I think I only scored 1 or 2 goals at most each of my 2 varsity seasons. Well, I guess I was on the varsity sophomore year, but I don't even remember whether I scored then or not. But we won. It didn't matter who scored the goals. It was exciting, and the chance to play against Ivy League teams like Dartmouth and Harvard, that was great. I still remember the bus going into Harvard and seeing Cambridge and all of that, and thinking, oh, this is kind of the big time, at least for soccer, because in those days Brown was challenging for the national championship.
Uh-huh.
And we played Brown, I think junior year. We didn't win that game for sure, but it was serious, and we worked hard.
The Harvard team that we beat, and I think this was at Williamstown, had the famous Chris Ohiri, the Nigerian star, on the team. Was I correct?
Yeah, that was. Yeah. That was, I think, our freshman year, or maybe it was even the year before freshman year. I remember Chafe telling us about that game. I didn't, this happened basically, I think, before
our time.
I think it was the year before we got there, but some of the guys that were, were still on the varsity as we came in as freshmen and sophomores. They had played in that game, and that was a big deal, beating Harvard.
Yeah.
Chafe talked about it all the time.
And you wrote a very nice tribute to him as a soccer player for our website. I want to thank you personally for that. There
Well,
were three tributes to him. Yeah.
There were several people at Williams who really did have a strong influence on me, and Coach Chafee was certainly one. And anyway, another one that clearly had a lot of influence on me was Professor Roger Bolton, the economics department. My junior year, I practically majored in Roger Bolton. I had the 301 major sequence course with him, and an independent study course with him, and also he was teaching some statistics stuff, some graduate 501 type statistics, which I petitioned into as well.
So, and who else would have been a guiding light for you at Williams?
Oh, well, on the track team, Tony Plansky was an institution, just like Chafee. And Plansky had all kinds of stories about, he was a remarkable athlete, and he would have gone to the Olympics in the decathlon, but I don't know, somehow or other he got squeezed out of it. He had finished first in the trials, I think it was 1924 or thereabouts, and then they told him he was in, and then they decided he had to show some fitness at some future meet where he finished fourth, and they dropped him from the team. But
that's too bad.
He could do anything. I remember one time in that little indoor ceiling track that we had over the gym,
Mm-hmm.
um, some guys before practice were trying to bowl a basketball all the way around that 110-yard bank ceiling track. And,
Right.
nobody could get any farther than about halfway around.
Uh-huh.
And Plansky shows up and he says, "What are you guys doing?" And so my roommate, Bill Dewart, said, "Oh, we're trying to bowl this all the way around." He said, "Well, let me have a go." So he takes the basket. Sure enough, he was he was a hammer thrower. That was actually his best event, which isn't even a decathlon event. Another story was apparently at about age 60, after he'd hurt his leg, he got frustrated with one of our hammer throwers and picked up the hammer and threw it past the Williams record, even on a gimpy leg at age 60.
My God. Yeah.
Yeah, he was just a remarkable guy.
So Williams seemed to have, I don't know where they came from, but in all dimensions, they're people who really, I think, were outstanding. For me, Ralph Townsend, and we're talking
Yeah.
about you, but I got to know him very well through the outing club, which I was active in. And these are people whose impact, I think, lasts. It hangs on. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we were so fortunate when we were there. We had, Coach Chafee in soccer and tennis and squash, and Coach Muir in swimming, and Tony Polanski in track and field and cross country, and then Townsend in skiing. All of these were, unbelievably, I would say, gifted coaches. And how they all arrived and stayed at Williams for so long is, I don't know, some kind of tribute to, I guess, the administration and able to lure and keep such quality coaches.
Well, I think it's not like, oh, how did that happen? Because if you go through that process, you get a sense of what draws people together and keeps them. And just a quick observation, it's always struck me that the number of people who are willing to go back to Williamstown, put on funny hats and walk up and down Route 2 after having these astonishing, successful careers. There is something that maybe beginning with the mountains that you saw that really gets in and keeps you going. Um, but I don't remember you being part of the outing club or maybe even skiing when I ran the PE skiing program. I don't know if I saw you. How did this begin? Yeah.
I never really had time to get into the outing club, because by the time soccer ended, right before Thanksgiving, it was, it had about a week or two before Thanksgiving, and then we were gone, and then we came back, and it was exams before Christmas.
Right.
Well, no, actually afterwards, that wasn't exams before Christmas till senior year, but just a lot of stuff happening between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and writing papers and just catching up with all the work that you put off during the soccer season. And then track and field, we started in, I didn't run indoor track, but I started training pretty early on in the, late winter. I did learn how to ski. I took the outing club skiing course and never really got to any serious level of expertise, but did a few nights at Brody Mountain and enjoyed it. And after I came back, I didn't really have much interest in downhill skiing, but I became a very active cross country skier. Was anytime the snow fell and I had time, particularly when I was working for myself, I'd phone a client and say, I've got important meetings until, mid-afternoon, and I'd go skiing and come back and catch up with them about 3 o'clock.
That's great. What about hiking and climbing? When did that kick in?
I grew up with some fellows who were scoutmasters and explorer advisors and in middle school and high school. They had a strong influence, and I didn't do very much hiking, but we did a lot of camping. And then in explorer scouts, there was more canoeing and spelunking and that sort of stuff. Um, I really didn't do a lot of hiking until actually, well, I did some hiking in the late fall at Williams. Of course, uh, I even borrowed some snowshoes once, and two or three of us climbed pine cobble in the snow on snowshoes.
Great.
Which when it turns out that pine cobble is steep, particularly on snowshoes.
Right.
But yeah, the one thing that I did do between uh, junior and senior year, I didn't have much luck getting a decent job. And after a while, I just decided I was going to go do something. So I stuck my thumb out and started hitchhiking around the country.
Hmm.
I ended up getting out into all the way up into Canada to Banff and Jasper and doing some
Oh.
hiking in those places.
Hmm.
Um, and that was by myself, obviously, hitchhiking. But I met some people there and ended up going with one Canadian bloke, and we hiked from Banff, from Lake Louise over to Moraine Lake over 9,000-foot pass. And then I jumped in Moraine Lake foolishly and almost had a heart attack. It was so cold.
At
But um,
least you stopped
you
sweating.
know, and the funny thing is that, that was, I guess, one of the things I put on my Peace Corps application. And I guess they were impressed that I was able to, kind of fend for myself for a
Hmm.
reasonably long period of time, because,
Hmm.
so many people in the Peace Corps have trouble being alone.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so that was, that was interesting.
Yeah, we're going to come back to the Peace Corps, but right now I want to move forward. So there's an arc that really does, in some ways, go back to Williams, to your experience in the Scouts. But at some point, here you are. At what age, roughly, that you begin your adventures on the Appalachian Trail, if I may be so bold as to inquire?
When I came back from 6 years overseas, 3 in Malaysia in the Peace Corps and 3 in New Zealand, I had done quite a lot of tramping in New Zealand. And when I came back, uh, my brother and I and 2 New Zealanders who traveled with me or who were in the United States, and I convinced we ought to hike some of the Appalachian Trail. So we started up at Mount Katahdin and spent 2 weeks on it, hiking south down to the Kennebec River crossing.
Hmm.
And that was really my first AT experience. Then later that
AT
same
is
year,
the abbreviation that people use for the Appalachian Trail.
yeah,
Yeah, okay.
I
Just for,
did some more AT stuff, just some weekend things with my brother over the first year or so. Um, but then I ended up getting married, and my wife had came along with a 4-year-old, so I became an instant father. And when I married her, and all of a sudden, a lot of outdoor activity got put on hold. Well, getting through the family stages.
so you had an early taste of it, but I've had a chance to look through some of the pictures you sent, and you're not in your 30s when you're doing that. So I'm trying to bring
Mm.
out sort of the 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 real thrust where you went at it more or less, I think, every year and knocked off another piece of it. How did that all take place?
Well, yeah, I, I had, I guess one of the influential things, my parents ended up in a two-family early on, in New Jersey with, uh, the people that lived downstairs became close friends of my parents, and they were avid outdoor people. And as early as 1950, this couple had hiked they'd done about a third of the Appalachian Trail from Mount Katahdin down to New Jersey.
Uh-huh.
And they, through the years, kind of influenced both me and my brother, with some information about the trail and what it was like. Um, and that was kind of my first, I guess, introduction to the idea that you could hike long distance. Um, and then, as I said, I spent some time in New Zealand with a bunch of very serious hikers and climbers. Every weekend, somebody from the flat that I lived in was out in a trail or a climb somewhere. And, and when I came back from New Zealand, two of those people rendezvoused with me and my brother, and we ended up doing this section of the AT, from Katahdin down, several hundred miles.
Yeah, Katahdin is the northmost extension of the Appalachian
Yes.
Trail. It's where it ends if you start in Georgia, or it begins, I guess, in your case, if you're heading the other direction. Do most people go south to north, or is there no
Yeah,
general?
most people do go south to north because you can start earlier in the south. In fact, there will be people starting an end-to-end trip starting in March. What happened with me was that my brother, we were both, um, contemplating or planning retirement at the same year. He's
Mhm.
2 years younger, but um, he called me up and wanted to know whether I wanted to hike the whole trail with him. And
Ah,
I told him I didn't think my knee would be able to handle it. I'd torn an ACL, several, a decade or two before. And I was always cautious about, uh,
yeah.
I'd become more of a linear guy, go in straight lines, gave up playing soccer
Uh-huh.
and basketballs and things like that, where you had to zigzag and cut. Um, anyway, I thought about it, and then I told my brother that I didn't think it would work for me, and I didn't want to slow him down.
So
Um,
roughly what age, pardon me for interrupting, were you? If you're about to retire, you're no
yeah,
longer 40.
I was 65, and my brother was 63.
Okay. And you're
Um,
going to hike the whole Appalachian Trail if it were for your brother. And
well, he was starting at Springer Mountain in early April, and I finally told him I didn't think I could do it. But then after he started sending reports back, I thought, well, the one thing I could do is hike the long trail, which starts at the Canadian border and goes south through Vermont to Massachusetts, basically to Williamstown, or between Williamstown and North Adams. Um, and if the timing was right, my brother and I would meet each other going in opposite directions someplace in southern Vermont.
uh-huh.
And that, in fact, is exactly what happened.
Ah,
We, the two of us met on the top of Bromley Mountain. It was late August. Um, and we, we had been conversing by a cell phone to know where each other, was at the time, and where this rendezvous might occur. And it all happened just as we planned. We had lunch up there, and then he had he told me, and when I saw him, he was really pretty run down. He'd come 1,600 miles. He still had 500 to go. Um, but it was getting a little late in August, and it was clear he wasn't going to make it all the way to Katahdin that season. And in fact, he told me he would go only as far as Dartmouth, and then he'd finish it the following summer.
Yeah.
And so what happened was that the following summer I joined him and hiked with him and his son Jake across the White Mountains of New Hampshire through to Maine.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Did you
we
go
had,
all the way to Katahdin?
I'm sorry.
Did you make it
Yeah,
all the way to Katahdin?
I didn't try to go all the way to Katahdin. I only did the New Hampshire and just the western edge of Maine.
Uh-huh.
And um, my brother's son Jake went with us as well, and he became the Sherpa. And
Nice to have
we
when
we
you're.
sent him ahead, particularly going through Mahoosic Notch there, which is a very tough section of the Appalachian Trail that
Uh-huh.
has all these big boulders that you got to scramble up around and under and over. And we sent Jake ahead to find the best route.
Uh-huh.
And you know,
So let's back off for just a second and let people know roughly what is the length. It starts in Mount Oglethorpe in Georgia and ends in
it
summit.
starts at Springer Mountain in
Oh, Springer
Georgia.
Martin. Why did I
Yeah,
remember
and
Springer
goes,
Mountain?
I think its official length is 2,158 miles, although it changes, they reroute it a little bit hither and yon at different years, it's a little longer, a little shorter.
Yeah. And many people might not know that it passes directly through Williamstown on its way north.
Yeah, it's basically, I guess, right on the edge of North Adams and Williamstown.
Uh-huh.
Can I, Alexander, I need to duck out for a second. There's somebody at the
Absolutely.
door. I'll be
No,
right
no,
back.
I'll wait here for you. Absolutely.
Sorry.
No
I'm
problem.
back.
So we were looking at total length. We talked a little bit about start time from Springer Mountain. And I just wonder, do we have anybody who has completed this through hiker, as I think they're called, uh, in 1 year, just gone straight?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was thinking you were going to ask whether I knew any Williams guys that had done it.
Yeah,
I'm sure there are some.
yeah.
I don't know who they might be, but every year, about probably 2,500 to 3,000 hikers start from Springer Mountain, and probably a few hundred, maybe 300, 400 will make it all the way in one season. And then there'll be others that may take, like my brother, he made it to Dartmouth, to Hanover, New Hampshire, and then he finished up the following season.
Uh-huh.
But the interesting thing about the trail is when it was kind of cobbled together out of all these little trail segments, and this was I forget the fellow's name who was kind of the godfather of the trail, but this all happened in about World War I time frame. They never thought that anybody was going to hike it straight through 2,000 miles was, it was just a trail that, people would do in small segments, 10 or 20 miles at a time, or you maybe a week at a time, and do 30 or 40 miles. The concept of doing end-to-end hiking is something that's much more, I don't know, certainly post-World War II.
Mhm.
And, now, of course, what's happened is that there's a little mini industry of hiker hostels and stores that cater to hikers with freeze-dried food and other kinds of supplies that hikers need to go through.
Mhm. Well, you mentioned the Mahoosics in New Hampshire. Uh, what were some of the most challenging parts of your experience on the trail? Or were there too
Well,
many
the
you
the
need more time for that?
the first few days of my hike south from Canada were fairly challenging.
On the long
I
trail.
On the long trail, yeah.
Yeah.
The funny thing is that if you look at the altitude profile of where the trail starts there in Canada, it doesn't look very imposing. Uh, the altitudes, it only goes up over maybe 27 or 2,800 feet.
Uh-huh.
Um, and that's nothing compared to later on you're going over Mount Mansfield at about 4,500,
Uh-huh.
or of course the White Mountains where you're all the way over 6,200 at Mount Washington.
Yeah.
These altitudes are nothing compared to plenty of other places on the Appalachian Trail.
Mm-hmm.
But the first few days out of going south from the Canadian border, it's straight up, straight down, straight up, straight down. And I didn't realize it because the altitude profile is just unassuming. But
Uh-huh.
if you actually total it all up, I only did about 10 miles the first day,
Uh-huh.
but I probably did 3,500 feet up and another 3,500 feet down, going over 3 or 4 of these, 1,000 feet up, 1,000 feet down type of things. Because in New England, they basically routed these trails as the shortest distance between 2 points. And if that meant taking them right over the top of some mountain, that's what they did.
Ah.
Whereas the trails in the southern end, like through the Smokies and Virginia, most of the trails were graded for horses or mules. And so they were much more gentle side, with switchbacks and just trails that skirted some of the mountaintops rather than trying to go straight over them.
Mm-hmm. So there have been a number of what I'm blanking on the name of the book. In the movie, it was Nick Nolte and maybe was it Robert Redford that played these buddies, sort of. Yeah, working. The book is a little more intriguing than the
Yeah.
movie, but the movie is enjoyable. And then you have Reese Witherspoon on the other side of the country in the Pacific Crest Trail, and you get to see the sort of camaraderie that develops, and people kind of run into each other, and they pick up trail names, which is obviously
Yeah.
not the real name. Did you have a trail name?
I, at some point, there were some people that kind of suggested a trail name for me, but my particular circumstance was that most of the people hiking on the long trail were hiking south to north, and because that trail starts a little more gently in the southern, on the Williamstown side of it,
Uh-huh.
and because it's part of the Appalachian Trail at the beginning. And
Uh-huh.
then the Appalachian Trail and the Long Trail divide at Killington.
Uh-huh.
The AT goes east into New Hampshire and Maine. and the Long Trail proceeds north into Canada. Um, at the time, I don't know, the first 2 weeks on the trail, I spent a lot of the time in shelters alone. And what happens, my brother got a trail name. He had gone on a kind of an adventure to Patagonia, and his name was Pat. And so I guess at some campfire early on in his travels, you know, he was telling people about this Patagonia adventure, and they immediately started calling him Patagonia because his name was Pat and he'd been to Patagonia. So that trail name stuck. I was telling some stories about my time in Invercargill, New Zealand, and some people thought Invercargill would be a good trail name, but turns out it had way too many syllables, and I just these trail names stick when the same group of people who start calling you by this name, you know, see you night after night in the same shelters or in the same places where you end up. But in my case, that just didn't really happen. And so when you read the log books in the shelters, a number of people will put their trail names in, but then a lot of people will just put in the name just Bob, you know, or just Bill. There's no trail name. They just use their own name, Bill or Bob.
You kept some pretty interesting journals. I think when we write this up for the website, we're going to, with your permission, quote a few passages from them. I want to, this is fascinating, and we do have these other, like the book that I was just talking about, and I will retrace my footsteps and make sure that the audio has the right name. I'd like to get back to the Peace Corps and how that affected your life and what you took away from it. Could also ask the same question about the Appalachian Trail and the Long Trail. What did you take away from that? So you can answer either or both.
Well, let me start with the Peace Corps. Bob Crescenti and I, amazingly enough, ended up in the same Malaysia Fisheries Peace Corps program. We actually met in California when we both got on the same airplane heading for Hawaii for Peace Corps training. Right after we graduated, Bob was going to Malaysia and I was supposed to go to the Philippines. But then a few days after graduation, they called me up and said, how would you like to change and go to Malaysia? We need some people with your economics background to do something in a fisheries program, which was going to run a survey of trawl fishing, looking at costs and earnings and that sort of thing. And the only question I had was, where does it train? And they said, oh, it trains in Hawaii, the same as the Philippines program. I said, when does it start? And they said, oh, it starts a week earlier. I said, I'm in. So, and unbeknownst, well, I knew Bob was going to be in the same. I didn't know that Bob was in the fisheries program. I knew he was going to Malaysia. And it turns out we met on the same, you know, air flight that left LA for Hawaii. We were quartered in an old Hawaiian school, kind of a barracks type thing. And where the three groups that were in our little area were fisheries, agriculture, and forestry. And they were all guys. There were no women in this. So we all were sleeping in like a military, you know, a big open classroom sort of thing. And, you know, it was kind of interesting. And when we got to Malaysia, Bob ended up near the capital city, but in a fishing village on the coast. And I ended up in a fishing village up in the northern part of Malaya near the Thai border.
Mhm.
But we would see each other occasionally, going down for medical checkups and that sort of thing. And
So
you know,
if I, pardon me for interrupting, I want to make sure that we squeeze in a lot in our hour. Uh, in terms of the actual experience and what you took away from it, how would you describe that? I'm also a Peace
um,
Corps veteran and have my own understanding, but I'd love to hear yours. Yeah.
well, the the first 2 years I worked in this fisheries program. I lived in a very small village. There's nothing to write home about, but I made some very close friends. I have been back to Malaysia 5 times.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for weddings, I was able to keep in touch with people originally just writing letters, usually Christmas cards or something. And then, of course, more recently with the internet, it's been much easier. Uh, Video calls now, you can see people and really have great conversations and catch up with all their children and grandchildren and all that sort of thing. The third year, I had met some school teachers and become very interested in helping them with mainly track and field type activities. And so the third year, when I re-enlisted, they moved me into something called the Ministry of Youth and Sport, where it was everything from coaching to organizing. At one point I got into, trying to organize a basketball league, and they didn't have referees. So even though I'm not much of a basketball player, I ended up being a referee for all these teams and games and whatever.
Wow.
It just, it just was, I don't know, it was an incredible opportunity to meet people. And the people that I met there, and this includes Muslims, it includes Buddhists, it includes Eurasians of Catholic uh, religion. Um, it covers a wide variety of people, and I just enjoyed meeting them and becoming friendly with them. Um, and when I go back now, I try to visit all of them again. And I've just been blessed to stay in contact with all these people.
So it's not just a 2 year or 3 year experience, it's one that's lasted a lifetime. What did you learn in terms of your overall experience that you carried forward, aside from the value of lasting friendships that may have influenced decisions that you made later in life?
Um, I, I guess the one thing I learned was somewhat academic. I had studied economics or political economy there as a major at Williams, and most of the kind of development economic theory that was in vogue at the time we were there was more about reducing barriers or constraints. And I think what I learned after being in the Peace Corps and working with people in rural areas like fishing villages and so on, that it was more about people than it was barriers, that people, once they were convinced that you could do something, whether it was um, they they were doing a project near where I was, that was
Hmm.
building a dam so they could double crop rice. But the big challenge was convincing the farmers at the time um, that they should take a chance, um, in planting and spending money, that everything would work out, because there was a risk. Anytime you do anything new, you're not sure whether it's going to work or not. And a lot of the challenges is just overcoming the human resistance to change.
Mm-hmm.
In fisheries, I worked with this one guy, the boats that we were dealing with, they would go out at night, catch fish, come back in the mid-afternoon and offload the fish. They never stayed out more than about 16 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And I, my initial thought was, well, it was of course hot in Malaysia. They needed some refrigeration on the boats in order to be able to stay out longer and preserve the fish. So this other fellow and I, we built literally some kind of a cooler type of thing using styrofoam that, would keep the fish cool and enable the boats to stay out for at least an overnight.
Mm-hmm.
And we tested this thing and kept ice for quite a reasonable amount of time, and we tried to sell it, or not sell it, but sell the boat captains on the idea of doing this, and we failed totally because the men wanted to come back and sleep with their wives. And there wasn't, and I didn't have a good strategy for how to address that.
Tough one to argue against. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then you did some learning.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the challenge is how do you break people's certain habits and break down their resistance.
Well, let's sort of wrap this up now. We're getting close to the end of our hour. What advice would you give to anyone considering adventuring on the Appalachian Trail? I think we're approaching late 70s, and it might not be a good time to start. But if you look at your experience, I think from a larger perspective, what would you advise someone?
Well, I would say if you're really interested in it, don't be afraid of doing it or trying it. There, I encountered quite a few people that were my age or at least in the 60s, and one guy was 80 years old, had already walked most of the trail in one season, and which I found absolutely amazing. The guy wasn't going to finish in 1 year, but he's doing 2/3 of it or thereabouts. But the main thing is that, it's more mental than it is physical. The physical side of it is important. And I think if you're our age, you need to do some training so that you don't hurt yourself in the first week or so that you're on the trail. But if you kind of take it slowly at the beginning, where you don't try to, march up a 4,000-foot kind of climb right on the very first day of the that you're out, then you get through the first week and you get you get fit fairly quickly.
Uh-huh.
But you don't want to bite off too much too soon.
Mm-hmm.
And then you pay attention to what your body's telling you, and if you have to take a day off or whatever, you do it.
Uh-huh.
Don't be in too big a hurry to get from A to B. Just kind of keep putting one foot in front of the other, and don't be afraid to try.
I think that's helpful advice for a lot of things.
Yeah,
You
no, it's
actually
true.
had I think a career shift that might have been linked to that attitude of not being afraid to try. Can you give us just a few words about how that worked out?
Um, I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to, but I started off working in consulting, mainly in a kind of natural resources and environmental stuff. And I got into a little bit of a political hassle where somebody leaked a report that I had done. This was back in the 80s when acid rain was a big political controversy. And I got blamed for things and ended up leaving the consulting firm that I was in and starting to work for myself.
Uh-huh.
Um, but that worked out okay. I was able to work for 20 years as an independent consultant. The one thing that then kind of happened was that the money for a lot of environmental work largely dried up in the early 90s, and I ended up transitioning away from environmental work into more market research. It still ended up, it was highly quantitative, and I did a lot of econometric modeling.
Uh-huh.
But you kind of have to be flexible and, you know, it
So
just,
some of these shifts weren't deliberate. You say, well, I've
yeah,
had
no,
enough of
the
X,
first
I'm going
one,
to
the
do
first
Y.
one was
Yeah.
not something that I planned. It just
Uh-huh.
all of a sudden, the president of the consulting firm that I was working for needed a scapegoat because the the electric utility people that were paying the bill were giving him all kinds of grief about the fact that this report got leaked, and
Yeah.
it didn't show the electric utility people in very good light. So
Well, it sounds like,
they needed a scapegoat, and I was it. So
sorry
that
that
was our.
happened. Yeah.
You
Well,
know what? It was for the best. I needed a change, and they kind of forced me to make the change. And frankly, it all worked out for the best.
one door
So
closes, another one opens. The,
yeah,
but the
that's right.
flexibility and the ability to reinvent
And
yourself
and in fact,
does link in, if you'll pardon me, somewhat to your experience of marching on the hiking on the Appalachian Trail. You come up
well,
against the, up and down like the beginning of the march on the long trail coming down from Canada, and you realize I got to change my strategy. Got to approach this a slightly different way. If I can't expect to do 20 miles, 10 is good luck when I consider the descents and ascents that I've got to go through. So I'm gonna wrap it
yeah,
up here, Doug, and we may come back and revisit a few things if you don't mind. But it's been a fascinating hour, and I'm really grateful for the time you have shared with us. And I'm sure our classmates will be more than happy to learn not only about your experience on the Appalachian Trail and the Long Trail, but the whole life story in general. I think it's offering people a chance to get to know each other from a completely different perspective. So many thanks for that, and we'll be in touch soon.
Alexander, thank you for the opportunity. Thanks for pulling this together.
You bet. Talk to you soon. Bye.